Hey, this is Brian from Love How Deep. Thanks so much for tuning in. Got another great video for you here today. But before we jump into today's topic, I want to encourage you, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. Wherever you find this video, please subscribe, hit that subscribe button, ring that bell, and you'll get all kinds of great content like what we're talking about today. And so today, what we're going to talk about is something called the drama triangle. And I find this happens a lot with couples and in families that we work with, especially when there's a lot of, I guess, tension and struggles and communication difficulties and conflict. And sometimes it can even happen to the best of families as we've seen it. And so I know when I've mentioned this drama triangle to the people that we work with, a lot of them, it kind of stops them in their tracks and they realize, oh, you know what, I can see kind of the role that I play in this. And so I want to talk a little bit about the triangle. I'm going to spend most of the time talking about the roles that people play in the triangle. And then as you're hearing this, what I want you to do is think about situations maybe in your family when it comes to communication and conflict management, working through problems. Does this drama triangle ever crop up? Do you notice the roles that maybe you play, that your spouse plays, maybe the kids play? And then toward the end, I'll talk a little bit about some things and some ways in which you can combat this and be a little bit different and hopefully have a better, triangle, so to speak. So the drama triangle was developed back in the 60s, and it was just kind of a way to describe what happens in a family dynamic in a situation, again, when tension rises, in that a lot of times each individual will kind of take on this role, and then the other individual might take on a different role. And it seems like all the roles kind of develop. And it's very rare that there'll be a couple family members that'll have the same role. It almost seems like it's natural that once one begins to play one role, then the other starts to play a different role. And so the first role I want to talk about is called the persecutor. And this is the individual that brings up the problem. We've got an issue, and sometimes they can get pretty aggressive. They can sort of push and poke and prod. And sometimes it can kind of slide into this place of, getting upset with somebody's personality or sort of who they are as to the core. And that's when it can get really messy. But again, the persecutor is the one that's pointing out the problems. And sometimes the persecutor can come from a place of, maybe growing up, there was a lot of tension, a lot of conflict in the family, that the individual that's the persecutor kind of sees this as the way to resolve conflict. Part of the unhealthy, though, place that a persecutor comes from is that a lot of times they can be pretty black and white. So they can kind of say, this is the way it needs to be. This is what's going to happen. And if you don't do it, then this is going to be the consequence. And, sometimes that can be okay. But a lot of times that really kind of rigid way of thinking doesn't allow for the family and others to kind of talk things out and to, come up with some nuanced kind of discussions and solutions potentially. So, but I get it as a persecutor, if that's what you are. I mean, maybe there's been times where you're just exasperated and you're kind of at your wit's end, and it's like, I don't know what else to do. Every time I try something, it doesn't seem to work. And so, you know what? I'm just going to kind of lay the hammer down. And, I get it. Sometimes that can be helpful, but a lot of times it's not. Again, the persecutor by nature, just that word means that, you're kind of putting somebody on trial. You kind of putting that spotlight on them, so to speak. And it's sometimes not real comfortable. So who does the persecutor typically kind of, I guess, have their animosity toward? They typically show their animosity toward the person that is called the victim. So there's the role of the victim. And the victim's exactly like probably what you would think it would be. It's somebody that, doesn't want to take blame, doesn't want to take responsibility. It's never my fault. It's always somebody else's fault. It's always somebody else's problem. It's not my problem. I've got all this stuff stacked against me. You're always against me. Everybody's against me. I can't catch a break. And with the victim, a lot of times, not always, but I've seen it play out where sometimes there's some alcohol or substance abuse in the victim that kind of lends them toward this type of behavior. But I think too, it can really come about in childhood as well. Although sometimes victims, a lot of times in families, victims end up being children just by their nature because they're younger, they're more immature, don't really know how to vocalize and communicate properly. And, just by its nature, the sort of the parent-child dynamic can kind of set that up as the case. But I've seen issues too where the persecutor is a spouse and the victim is another spouse. So it can be two adults as well. But again, the victim is just not taking responsibility for the situation. And it's really hard to get through to them. And so, yeah, those typically are where the tangle starts, so to speak, the persecutor and the victim. And then somebody else in the family dynamic tends to come along and want to do something about this situation. And they're what's known as the rescuer. And the rescuer is one that either wants to rescue both people and wants to end the conflict and bring the tempers down, or sometimes they might gravitate toward the victim and they want to try to rescue the victim, and they look at the persecutor as the one that's like the bad guy, and it's like, hey, persecutor, you need to bring it down a notch. And I will say, in our family dynamic, we were once a blended family. I don't know if you'd call it that anymore because we're empty nesters, but at some point we had my daughter in the household, and I typically would play that role of the rescuer. So it might be a situation where my wife Heather, who's the step parent, upset about something or feeling that rules weren't followed, and then my daughter is kind of playing that victim role of well, this is hard, and it's difficult being in a blended family, and I'm coming and going, and this is not easy, and then I would kind of swoop in, and I didn't do things correctly from time to time. Like, I'll admit once I basically kind of threw Heather under the bus, my wife under the bus, and in front of my daughter, and that's not really appropriate. And we'll get into probably some better ways to handle things when it comes to these different roles. But right now, I just want you to understand what the roles are. So again, victim role is sort of, it feels like they're blameless, and it's not their fault, it's not their responsibility, it's always somebody else's fault. And when they're asked to do something, it's like, well, I can't, or here's the reasons I can't. So yeah, so we've talked about the persecutor, we've talked about the victim, and then we've talked about the rescuer that tends to come in. And then the fourth role that can be played, even though we're calling this a triangle, there's a fourth role, and it's called the bystander. And I guess you could probably make an argument that maybe the bystander isn't even really in this triangle as to why it's not part of the triangle. But I do believe it even though a bystander is somebody that's not really doing anything, just kind of watching. I mean, if you think about it, you probably see it, when you're watching a video of, I don't know, a police officer and interacting with somebody in the public, and there's a potential arrest, and there's issues. You can kind of see people standing around. Some people are like videoing, and other people are just kind of watching and gawking. And, you think about that too on the roadway when you're driving past an accident, and you'll see just people kind of slowly, whether they call it rubbernecking. Those are bystanders is what those are. Those are people that don't really want to get involved. And sometimes they can be kind of quiet and passive and not really say a whole lot about what's happening. Other times they might be pointing fingers at, what are you always arguing? What's the problem? And why are you doing this? And why are you doing that? So there can be somebody that's a little bit more active in the situation, but tends to be somebody that just doesn't want to deal with it. Maybe goes into their room and again, doesn't get involved in the situation. So those are the four kind of main roles that play out in a drama triangle. I would ask you, think about communication and conflict in your family and think about who plays what role. Typically, people will generally gravitate toward the same role. Occasionally, depending on the issue, there might be a little bit of a reversal. I mean, I know in our dynamic that happens to be the case. Like if it's, a situation over, I don't know, taking a trip and spending a lot of money, I might become the persecutor and say like, we don't have the money to do this and there's a problem, and I might start to get a little anxious about it, and I might start to, point the finger at my wife and say, why are you always wanting to spend all this money when we don't have it? And she doesn't, by the way. She's very good about that. But I can tend to kind of get, has that little sort of stuff kind of bubble up from within. And I guess that brings me to a good point in that a lot of this comes from our childhoods, as does a lot of things. And so, again, like I mentioned before, the persecutor can tend to come from a very conflict, laden home, to where that's the way they see how it should go. We should just be able to get into it. We shouldn't be able to get tangled up, and that's okay. The victim, a lot of times, maybe could come from a conflict laden home where they feel like they can't get anywhere and they don't know what else to do. So every time they just kind of bump their head up against the wall and they can't really get anywhere. And so that could potentially be why they do what they do, although it can also come from just a very passive household as well. The rescuer, I would say that probably comes from well, you know what? The more I think about it as we're talking, I think it could come from either a conflict laden home where the rescuer is, because I've heard stories like this before, people telling me, their parents were arguing, and as they got older into their teenage years, they began to kind of start to stand up to either one or both parents, and kind of say, hey, look, this is not, what are we doing here? Can we calm this down? So again, becoming that rescuer. But it can come from also a home that's a little bit more passive, and maybe they're not arguing and sometimes sweeping things under the rug. I know for me, that rescuer mentality plays out in humor. I like to kind of be funny, and when I feel like things are getting awkward or conflict's starting to bubble up, I will tend to maybe throw out a joke and just to kind of lighten the air. And I mean, sometimes that's appropriate, but sometimes it's not appropriate because it could be good to have some conflict and good to kind of get things out on the table. And I think at some point, I don't remember who it was with or what family members, but there was some tension building, and I happened to throw out a joke, and I think somebody said to me like, "Hey, that's not appropriate right now. That's not it's not a funny situation. That's a serious stuff." And I kind of got put in a place there, and so I try to be careful and try to read the room as best I can. I mean, you're not always going to be accurate to know exactly what to do, so but just something to watch out as a rescuer. So, but again, can potentially come from childhood there. The bystander, obviously, potentially that's a situation where maybe as a child tried to jump in on something didn't go well. Maybe got physically or emotionally hurt. And now it's just like, nope, not dealing with the stuff anymore. So yeah, that would be another, I guess, key for you is just to look back to childhood just a little bit, just to see, is there anything back there that kind of is leading me to do what I do now? A lot of people, when I tell them about going back to childhood, they kind of get frustrated. And it's like, well, can't we just sort of, figure out what's going on right now and solve the problem? And yes, that is extremely important. So good to go back into childhood just to see, because we can kind of see, oh, this is why I act the way I do, or this is why I do what I do. And it kind of gets you away from that, well, I'm right and they're wrong. It kind of helps you see, well, I can see where, based on my experiences and what I've been through, this is why I do what I do. So I would highly encourage you to do that. And then just sort of finally, just some tips and keys when it comes to each of these roles for you to think about. I would say as a persecutor, if you are the persecutor, on occasion, try to bring the volume down. Do you have to flare up as badly? Do you have to be as black and white? Maybe you can find some areas in the gray a little bit more to operate in, be a little bit more flexible. I would encourage you to do that. As the victim, take responsibility, even if it's just a little bit. And even if it's just vocalizing it, it might be, I tell you what, I do have this tendency to kind of be lazy at night. I get home from school or whatever, and I'm probably not wanting to do the chores like you want me to do, and so I know I need to work on that. Now you're probably, I know as you're hearing this, if your child is the victim, you're like, yeah, that's never going to happen, and I get it. It's not going to be easy, but maybe something that you could do to help is try to empower them as much as you can, by giving them some choices, and maybe even some encouragement along the way. I know for me personally, I've never been really good about, that coach that kind of just yells and, is motivated by yelling. That never really worked with me, but and maybe for some kids it does. And I know the generations as we've gone along, if you're in an older generation, you're probably looking at me like, yeah, I'm just a softie. But, if it works, if really kind of coming down on a child works and you're noticing it helps, then maybe you keep doing it. But if you're noticing it's not working, then maybe focus more on encouragement and uplifting and empowering and giving choices and, helping them see what positive outcome would happen if they do a certain thing. Things like that. And again, I know it's not going to go perfectly, but something you might want to consider for the victim. As a rescuer, again, maybe typically just taking a step back. I would say, obviously, if your spouse is a persecutor and you're the rescuer, then obviously dialoguing with your spouse, trying to be as united as you can, letting them know that, hey, my personality is maybe one where I don't come down as hard on a child. So this is a struggle for me to do the types of things that you're looking for. I want to get there. I want to try to be a little bit different, but just know that my personality is such that it's going to be a little bit difficult. So just remember that. And then, so yeah, as a rescuer, again, maybe have a tendency to either, number one, maybe take a little bit more of a step back and kind of let the things play out between the persecutor and the victim, again, if it's healthy, or again, try to see if you can align a little bit more with that persecutor. And maybe by doing that, kind of brings the persecutor down a little bit, and then maybe kind of brings you up a little bit and kind of what you're planning to do when it comes to that victim and how to handle them. And then a bystander, sometimes that can be a spouse, sometimes it can be another child. If you're a spouse and you're a bystander, then obviously kind of jumping in a little bit more. And is there anything I can do to help here? I want to help the situation. Like, what can I do? And then if it's a child that's a bystander, I would say probably it's probably okay. I mean, I would say check in with your child when it comes to that. Hey, I noticed you went off to your room when tension started to rise at dinner time. Hey, what's going on? Tell me about this. How are you feeling about everything that's going on? Just check in with them would be very helpful. So I hope this has helped you understand the drama triangle a little bit more, kind of what it is, potentially where it comes from, the roles that people play in the drama triangle, some of the potential solutions to help in that area. If you like this video, please subscribe to our channel, our YouTube channel, if that's where you're seeing this. Hit the subscribe button, ring the bell, and we'd love to bring you into the fold, into the family of Love How Deep. We certainly have tons of room for couples that want to strengthen their marriage, want to connect more with each other, want to connect greater to God as well. That's very important to us as well. So thanks so much for joining and watching, and we will talk to you next time. Take care.